The Boeing 747 hummed with the restless energy of 300 passengers settling into their seats, but in first class, a different kind of turbulence was brewing. Margaret Chen stood in the aisle, her weathered hands clutching a boarding pass, while two flight attendants exchanged pointed glances above her head. She wore what she always wore, a simple cotton dress with faded sunflowers, sturdy leather boots caked with yesterday's soil, and her grandmother's jade bracelet that caught the cabin light. At 63, with silver hair pulled into a practical bun and sun-creased eyes that had witnessed 5 decades of dawn harvests, she looked exactly like what she was, a farmer. And in the gleaming temple of first class, surrounded by pressed suits and designer luggage, she looked, to some, like a mistake. "Ma'am, are you certain this is your seat?" The lead attendant, Jessica, spoke with the kind of forced politeness that barely masked contempt. Her perfectly manicured nail tapped against Margaret's ticket. First-class passengers usually board through the priority entrance. Margaret's smile never wavered, though something flickered in her eyes. Not hurt, but a bone-deep weariness at being underestimated yet again. "I came through the regular gate. Seemed shorter." Her voice carried the gentle cadence of someone who spoke more to plants and animals than people, but beneath it lay bedrock certainty. Behind her, other first-class passengers were boarding, their expensive fragrances mingling with the recycled air. A man in a Brioni suit cleared his throat impatiently. A woman in Chanel sunglasses whispered something to her companion, and they both laughed, a crystalline sound that cut through the cabin. "Perhaps there's been a mix-up with your ticket," Jessica persisted, her voice rising slightly. "We could find you a lovely seat in economy. Very comfortable there." Margaret set down her worn canvas bag, the same one she'd carried to farmers, markets for 30 years, and pulled out her phone with hands that could birth calves and prune roses with equal skill. She opened her banking app, not to prove anything, but because she was tired. Tired of the assumptions. Tired of being invisible until she became inconvenient. "My seat is 2A, she said quietly. "I paid for it, and I'd like to sit down now, if that's all right." The co-pilot emerged from the cockpit for his pre-flight walkthrough and stopped, reading the tension immediately. "Is there a problem here?" Jessica straightened, her professional mask slipping. "This woman claims she's booked in first class, but clearly there's been some error." "No error," Margaret interrupted, her patience finally thinning. "What's clear is that you've decided what I can and cannot afford based on how I'm dressed." The cabin had gone quiet. Every passenger within earshot was watching now, some with sympathy, others with the eager anticipation of those witnessing drama that didn't involve them. A businessman in seat 1C stood up, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look, maybe someone bought you this ticket as a gift and you don't understand how these things work. First class is for business travelers, people who need to work, who have important meetings, people who matter," Margaret finished for him, her voice steady as a held note. "That's what you mean." His face reddened, but he didn't back down. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Jessica seized what she saw as an opportunity. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to deplane if you can't provide proper documentation that you belong in this cabin." Something shifted in Margaret's expression then. Not anger, but a profound sadness that aged her another decade in seconds. She thought of her daughter, Sarah, who'd begged her to retire, to sell the farm, to finally rest. She thought of the years she'd spent growing organic produce, feeding her community, donating half her harvest to food banks because hungry children mattered more than profit margins. She thought of the countless times she'd been dismissed, overlooked, treated as less than because her hands bore soil instead of ink. "I belong anywhere I choose to be," Margaret said, and for the first time, steel entered her voice. "But since you insist on documentation," she didn't pull out her boarding pass again. Instead, she scrolled through her phone and turned the screen toward Jessica. The flight attendant's face went from smug to confused to utterly pale in the span of 3 seconds. That's a Gulfstream G650, Margaret confirmed. "My private jet." "Well, one of them. The other's a Global 7500, but I prefer the Gulfstream for international flights." The businessman in 1C sat down abruptly. Jessica's mouth opened, closed, opened again. I don't understand. I'm sure you don't. Margaret's voice remained gentle, but it carried weight now, the authority of someone who'd built an empire from seeds and soil. You see, 25 years ago, I had 40 acres and a dream. I believed in organic farming before it was fashionable, in sustainable practices before they became buzzwords. I sold at farmers markets and slept 4 hours a night. Then one of my clients, a chef at a restaurant I'd never been able to afford, started telling other chefs. Who told restaurant owners? Who told investors? She paused, looking around at the captive audience. Nobody moved. Today, Chen Organic supplies 70% of the organic produce to restaurants and grocery stores across the West Coast. We employ over 3,000 people. Last year's revenue exceeded $800 million. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she might comment on rainfall totals. But I still get up at dawn. I still check the soil myself. I still wear my work clothes because they remind me where I came from. The cabin remained silent, except for the ambient hum of the aircraft. So yes, I own private jets. But I usually fly commercial because I like reminding myself that I'm not special, not better than anyone else here. Wealth doesn't make you important. Character does. Kindness does. How you treat people when you think they can't do anything for you, that's what matters. Jessica had tears in her eyes now. Mrs. Chen, I'm so sorry. There's no excuse for... Margaret held up her hand, not unkindly. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. But maybe you'll be the one who remembers that you can't judge a person's worth by their appearance, their clothes, or their occupation. She looked at the businessman. That every single person you meet is carrying a story you know nothing about. She finally moved toward her seat, but the co-pilot gently touched her arm. Mrs. Chen? I recognize you now. My brother works at your facility in Sacramento. You paid for his daughter's leukemia treatment when his insurance maxed out. You probably don't remember. You helped so many people. But he's told that story 100 times. She's in remission now. She's 8 years old, and she's going to live because of you. Margaret's eyes grew misty. Of course I remember. Little Emma with the butterfly drawings. How could I forget? The businessman stood again, but this time his posture was different, humbled, smaller. I apologize sincerely. That was inexcusable. It was, Margaret agreed. But apology accepted. We all have room to grow. As she settled into her seat, placing her canvas bag carefully under the seat in front of her, something remarkable happened. The woman in Chanel sunglasses leaned across the aisle. I run a foundation for rural education, she said quietly. I'd love to talk to you about partnership opportunities. Not because of your money, because of who you are. By the time the plane taxied for takeoff, Margaret had received 3 business cards, 5 heartfelt apologies, and 1 request from a young man in 3B who wanted to know how to start organic farming with limited resources. She spent an hour during the flight sketching out a plan for him on a cocktail napkin, explaining about soil composition and companion planting with the same passion she'd had 40 years ago. Jessica approached with a first-class meal Margaret hadn't ordered. On the house, she whispered. And Mrs. Chen, I'm enrolling in some diversity training. Real training, not just the corporate requirement stuff. Thank you for not having me fired. Margaret smiled, the warmth returning to her eyes. Everyone deserves a chance to do better. That's called grace. As the plane soared over quilted farmland 37,000 feet below, Margaret looked out the window at land that might have been hers in another life, or maybe was hers, in the ways that mattered. She thought about the jets sitting in their hangar, expensive toys she barely used. She thought about her simple farmhouse, her vegetable garden, her community that knew her as Maggie who brings the tomatoes. True wealth, she'd learned, wasn't measured in bank accounts or private planes. It was measured in Emma's remission, in the young man's napkin covered with farming notes, in Jessica's commitment to change. It was measured in every seed planted with hope, every harvest shared with gratitude, every moment of grace extended when judgment would have been easier. The humble farmer closed her eyes and smiled, knowing that tomorrow she'd be back in her fields, hands in the soil, exactly where she belonged.